The papers were read in the back room of the Mercantile in Mercer Fork, where debts were counted and futures decided. It was cold, the kind of cold that made people sharp. Tobin Vale stood in the center, 17, quiet, empty-handed. Across from him, Mrs. Hester Crow, the town's probate custodian, read without emotion. 7.5 miles of wind, a dying stand of scrub oak on Crow's Ridge, and a cabin in Blackstone Coulee not fit to winter stock. The room broke into laughter, not polite, not hidden. Men leaned back. Someone said, "That boy's been handed nothing." Another added, "Worse than nothing." No one tried to stop it. Tobin did not react. Not a word, not a step. Only once did something change. When she repeated it, "Scrub oak, dying on Crow's Ridge," his eyes lifted, just slightly, not in protest, in thought. In the corner, a lean ash-colored dog raised its head. It didn't bark, it listened. The laughter faded. The paper closed. "That is your inheritance," Mrs. Crow said. When the room emptied, what Tobin Vale owned could be counted without effort. $1.17. A rolled blanket, a spare shirt, a knife worn smooth from use. And a claim last sold for $21, proof enough of what men thought it was worth. Outside, the wind moved down the street of Mercer Fork and pressed against the walls. Inside, a boy stood with what everyone agreed was worthless. But not everyone heard it the same way, because sometimes, the thing people laugh at first is the only thing that keeps a man alive when winter decides to speak. If you're drawn to survival stories set against harsh, cold, and difficult conditions, you can stay with Tobin's journey by leaving a like and subscribing. Your support will help motivate me to share the next parts. What they did not see in that room was not new. It had been building for years. Tobin Vale had been left with less before. His father, a freight driver hauling timber between Red Crossing and Mercer Fork, died when a loaded wagon tipped along a frozen cutbank road. The chains held, the wheels did not. The drop was short. It was enough. His mother lasted one winter after that in Alder Creek, taking in washing until the cold settled in her lungs and stayed. After she died, Tobin was passed on in pieces of time. 4 months with the Harrow family outside Mercer Fork, until Mrs. Harrow said the boy noticed too much and made her sons uneasy. 5 months with Abel and Ruth Kester near Dry Willow, until Tobin corrected their stove draft out loud, and Abel Kester decided that kind of thinking brought trouble. 1 lambing season with the Doleys at Sandcut, where he asked why their south wall always froze first, and was told questions like that wore a man thin. Then a church boarding room in Red Crossing, where he lasted longest because books could be stacked where a boy could not. They all said it differently. Too observant, too quiet, asks the wrong questions. So he read ledgers, manuals, repair notes. Most people had no use for that. Winter did. By the time he stood in that room, Tobin Vale owned almost nothing, except what he had learned. He left Mercer Fork 2 days later. No one tried to stop him. The road held for the first few miles packed dirt, wagon ruts, something a man could follow without thinking. Then it thinned, then it broke. Then it became a direction more than a path, bending south out of town toward Blackstone Coulee. 7.5 miles from Mercer Fork, the land opened into Coulee country. The ground was cut deep, as if water had once tried to take it and failed halfway through. Ridges of clay and stone folded into each other. Wind moved through it without slowing, sliding low across the earth, changing direction without warning. The scrub oak stood twisted along Crow's Ridge, not tall, not straight, bent in the same direction, like they had learned the cost of standing against it. Ash stayed close to the wagon at first, then closer to Tobin. By the time the cabin came into view in Blackstone Coulee, the light was already thinning. It sat low in a shallow dip, 11 by 15 feet, logs no thicker than a man's wrist in some places. The chinking had fallen out in long seams. In 2 sections, Tobin could see daylight clean through the wall. The door stuck when he pushed it open. Inside, the air held old ash, damp earth, and the quiet of something that had not been lived in for years. He set his small pack down and stood there, listening. That night, he did not sleep. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed frame, coat still on, eyes moving from wall to wall, measuring gaps, counting failures. At first light, he could walk back to Mercer Fork. 7.5 miles. He had done worse. Ash did not sleep either. The dog lay near the door, head lifted, watching the dark, not the room, the wind, and sometime near dawn, as the cold settled deeper into the wood, one truth stood clear. The road disappeared before the land did. Morning did not make the cabin in Blackstone Coulee better. It made it honest. In daylight, the failures showed themselves without effort. Gaps along the west wall wide enough to pass a finger through, a roofline that dipped just enough to hold drifting snow, a floor that sounded different in one corner hollow, not rotten, just empty. Tobin noticed it on the second pass. He stepped there again. Same sound, not solid, not earth. He crouched, pressed his palm flat, and shifted his weight. The board moved, slightly. He worked it loose, then the next, then the third. Beneath sat a wrapped box, sealed in oilcloth. Inside were notebooks, maps, a carpenter's rule marked in pencil, and a name, Tarlin Voss. Tarlin Voss had been his mother's uncle, a ridge settler out of Blackstone Coulee. Most men in Mercer Fork remembered only as a quiet man who lived alone beneath Crow's Ridge, burned less wood than seemed possible, and survived winters that had driven others back toward town. The notebooks held no years, only winters. First hard ground. After the long freeze, Tobin began to read. Not stories, records. Someone had measured this place. And long before Tobin arrived in Blackstone Coulee, someone in his own blood had already fought this winter and written down how. He did not read them once. He read them until the light failed. Then again, by lantern. The pattern did not take long to show itself. Tarlin Voss had not been studying fire. He had been studying loss. Every entry circled the same truth from a different angle. Floor temperatures taken at dawn. Notes on how long heat held after the stove went low. Sketches of cracks along each wall, marked where the draft cut strongest. The problem was never a lack of fuel. The problem was that the cabin could not keep what it was given. Heat rose, slipped, pulled through seams, carried out by moving air faster than any fire could replace it. Tobin closed one notebook and opened another. There, the drawings changed. A top view of the room, a line traced along the inside of every wall, measured, repeated, adjusted. Stack wood. Inside, not against the wall, away from it. Beside the line, a number, 3.25 inches, and a note written smaller than the rest. Air that does not move does not carry heat. No long explanation, no theory spelled out, only results. One page showed frost building along the outer logs, thick, white, unbroken. Another showed the inner surface dry. A third recorded the difference in temperature across that narrow space. Tobin looked up from the page and studied the walls around him again. Thin logs, open seams, wind already finding its way in. He did not need the rest explained, because the notebooks were not telling him how to build heat. They were showing him where it was bleeding out, and once he saw it, the answer stood plain. The wall was the wound. Understanding it did not mean finishing it. There was not enough time for that. The ground hardened early that year. The wind shifted sooner than the notes had warned. By the time Tobin finished cutting and splitting what he could, he had only built one wall north side, where the wind struck hardest. It stood uneven in places. The gap behind it was not always true. Some sections held close to the 3.25 inches marked in the notebooks. Others did not. It would have to do. Winter did not wait for precision. The cold came down fast. Food ran short first. What little he had carried in lasted days, not weeks. After that, it was what he could find, what he could catch, what he could endure. The heat followed. He fed the stove constantly. Split wood, burned it hard, watched the flame rise strong and disappear just as fast. The cabin did not hold it. Frost formed along the inside of the south wall, thin at first, then thicker. The wash basin froze at the edges. His breath hung in the air longer each night. His hands cracked along the knuckles. Skin split open and stiffened in the cold. He wrapped them, kept working. The north wall helped. That much was true. Where the wood stood, the cold did not bite as deep. The floor there held a little warmth longer than the rest of the room. But it was not enough. Not yet. Nights stretched. Sleep came in short pieces. The thought of walking back returned often. 7.5 miles. A door that closed. Food, he did not have to earn one. Split at a time. He did not go. Because somewhere between the frost on the wall and the wood he kept feeding into the fire, one fact settled in without argument. He was not cold because he lacked fuel. He was cold because the cabin could not keep what he burned. He was burning wood and losing heat. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in patches. Snow pulled back from the higher ground first. Mud followed, then access, then work. Tobin did not start with the walls. He started with the ground. The notebooks had been clear on one point. Wood placed directly on earth failed early. Moisture climbed. Stability shifted. The whole system followed. So he built runners, strips of salvaged lumber, set level along the inside perimeter of the cabin, raised just enough to keep the wood off the dirt, straight where the floor was not, shimmed with flat stone where the cabin had settled uneven over time. Only after that did he begin cutting again. Scrub oak from the ridge, crooked, stubborn, not clean like millwood. It split hard, broke uneven. Some pieces twisted as they dried, others held straight. He cut anyway, measured length 17, 18, sometimes 19 inches, close enough to stack, close enough to hold. The first courses went up slow, gap too narrow in one section, too wide in another. He adjusted, tore it down, set it again. A week later, part of the wall shifted and collapsed without warning. Not the whole structure, just enough to prove the point. He did not stop. He rebuilt it, added cross pieces, watched how the weight settled, corrected where it leaned. Day after day, the pattern formed. Measure, cut, stack, check, adjust. The room grew smaller. The system grew clearer. By the time the heat returned fully to the land, the north wall stood straighter than before. The west side had begun. Not finished, not perfect, but no longer guesswork. Because somewhere between the first collapse and the second rebuild, something changed. The doubt that had followed him through winter no longer led. Work did. And from that point forward, he did not wonder if it could be done. He worked until it held. By midsummer, he walked back into town for salt, oil, and a new wedge for splitting. The place had not changed. Same porch, same barrels out front, same men leaning where work had paused but talk had not. Tobin did not stop. He went straight to the counter. Mrs. Lena Brigg, who ran the boarding house and kept track of everyone who came and went, noticed him before he spoke. She had a way of seeing people as problems first. "I hear you're living out on that ridge," she said. "I am, and filling that cabin with wood." She studied him, not unkindly, but without respect. "Stacking it inside, they say." He did not answer. She shook her head once. "That's not how it's done. That's how men burn themselves out or burn their place down. Fire trap fool, if you ask me." A few men nearby listened. One smiled without looking up. Tobin set his coins on the counter, took what he needed. "No more. You're young," Mrs. Brigg added. "You can still come back before winter proves the point for you." He nodded once. Not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked out. No argument, no explanation. Outside, the wind moved the same way it always had, low, steady, without asking permission. Inside the mercantile, they had already decided what he was. Out on the ridge, it would be decided another way. And Tobin Vale did not waste words on things that would soon be measured in colder terms. He had the north wall solid by late season. The west was rising. The system was taking shape. Then the weather shifted. It came warm, too warm. A sudden lift in temperature rolled across the ridge and held for 2 days. Snow softened. The ground loosened. The outer layers of stacked wood pulled moisture from the air and held it. On the third morning, Tobin saw it before he touched it. The line was wrong. The wall along the doorside had moved. Not much, just enough. A lean where there had been none. He stepped closer. The lower courses had held. The weight above had not. The stack listed outward, close to 10 degrees. Not fallen. Not yet. But waiting. He did not test it. He tore it down, piece by piece. Fast at first, then slower as the pattern revealed itself. The wood had shifted where the runners dipped. The pressure had moved uneven through the height of the wall. Moisture had softened what had been tight. By midday, the entire section was gone. He stood in the empty space and looked at the notes again. Then at the ceiling, then at the floor. Stacking was not enough. Not if the system had to survive change. He cut new lengths of willow from the low ground where the soil still held water, split them thin, flexible, strong enough to bind. He rebuilt the base, corrected the runners, leveled what the cabin had never been built to hold. Then he added restraint. Every few courses, he tied the stack back, not to the wall, to itself, to cleats driven into the beams above, to anchors that would not shift with the wood. He worked slower the second time, measured more, forced nothing. When it stood again, it did not look the same. Not a pile, not even a wall, not entirely. Something between, because at some point between the collapse and the rebuild, the work had crossed a line. This wasn't stacking anymore. It was structure. The cold returned without warning. Not the long winter yet. Just a drop, sharp and clean. The kind that usually found every weakness in a place like that. Tobin felt it before he saw it. The wind shifted in the night. Ash lifted his head once, then settled again. By morning, the air had tightened. He did not rush the fire. He let the stove come up slow, watched it, waited. Then he stood and checked the room the way the notebooks had taught him. First, the floor. He crouched near the north wall and set his palm down flat against the boards. Last winter, that spot had been biting cold, enough to pull heat straight through the skin. Now, it was cool, not warm, not comfortable, but not pulling heat away. He held it there longer than he needed to, just to be certain. Then he moved to the wall. He pressed his hand against the inner face of the stacked wood. Dry, slightly cool, holding. After a moment, he turned, reached down, and pulled up the loose plank he had left near the base. Cold air moved there, stronger, sharper. He leaned in and looked through the gap between the old log wall and the wood stack. Frost had formed, thick, white, unbroken along the outer logs. It had pushed in as far as it could, and stopped. It did not cross the space. It did not reach the inner wall. Tobin let the plank settle back into place and stood still in the center of the room. No sound but the stove drawing steady and the wind working outside where it belonged. For the first time since he had stepped into that cabin, the cold was not inside with him. He exhaled once, slow. Then, without thinking, he let out a short laugh. Not loud, not long, just enough to mark the moment. Because the system had held, and for the first time, it had not been a theory. It was fact. He did not have to tell anyone. The smoke did it for him. It rose thin and steady from the stovepipe, even in a wind that should have torn it apart. Not the heavy, wasteful smoke of a fire fighting the cold, but a narrow line that held its shape. That was what brought Thane Hollow up the ridge. Thane was a wagon builder once, a man who had spent most of his life making wood hold under weight and weather. He had known Tarlan Voss years back, when the ridge still saw traffic, and the cabin still held a man who spoke little and measured much. He arrived without announcement, tied his horse to a low branch, walked straight to the door. Tobin opened it. Thane did not speak at first. He stepped inside and stood still, letting his eyes adjust. Then he moved. Slow, deliberate, he checked the gap first, not with a ruler, with his hand, sliding fingers into the space between stacked wood and outer wall, feeling for consistency, for places where the air might move when it shouldn't. Then the base. He crouched and pressed against the runners, tested for give, watched how the weight settled into the floor, then the wall itself, a firm knock, not loud, just enough to read the response. Solid where it should be, slight variance where the structure changed. He moved to the corner, followed the vertical line up with his eyes, watched for drift, for lean, for anything that would fail under pressure. Only after that did he turn back. "Your uncle was right," he said, nothing more at first. The words did not carry surprise, only confirmation. Thane stepped closer to the stove, then back again, measuring the space between heat and fuel. "You've got the idea," he added, "but you're carrying weight uneven in two places. It'll shift again if you don't correct it." He pointed once, then again. "Load needs a path, straight down, not out. Spread it, or it'll find its own way." He glanced at the ceiling. "And give yourself a safety line. Fire don't care about your plans." Tobin listened, said nothing. Because this was not instruction given lightly. This was a man who had built things that either held or buried the ones who trusted them. And now, standing in that small room, he had seen enough, not to approve, to recognize that what had been dismissed as foolishness was built on something real. Thane did not stay long at a time, but what he gave held. Tobin corrected the base where it dipped, reset the runners, drove the load down clean instead of letting it push outward, added tie points higher along the wall where the weight began to shift, left a clear margin around the stove where heat could work without risk. Then he continued. Through the rest of that season and into the next, the system closed in around him. North wall finished first, then west. The east took longer, where the cabin leaned and the ground gave less support. The south, last of all, where the wind struck less but still found its way in. 4 walls, built inward. By the time he was done, the room had narrowed to a tight square, just enough space to move from door to stove, from stove to bed. Around him, nearly 4 cords of scrub oak stood stacked, base near 30 inches thick, tight where it needed to be, bound where it had to hold. He kept numbers the way Tarlin had. Morning and night, outside temperature, inside temperature, floor level, wall edge. On the coldest reading he took that year, the thermometer outside dropped to 52 below. He left it there long enough to be sure, then brought it in. Inside, near the stove, it held at 54 above. At the outer edge of the wood wall, just above freezing. He wrote it down without pause. 106 degrees of difference across a space a man could step across in 2 strides. No argument, no guess, just measure. Because by then, it was no longer a matter of belief. The numbers held, and the room held with them. It did not stay contained to the ridge. Men noticed things that work. Dr. Elias Boone, the town's only physician and a man used to reading bodies the way others read weather, came out under the pretense of checking on Thane. He stepped into the cabin, stood still for a moment, and then began to look. Not at the stove, at the walls. He moved slowly, touched the wood, checked the gap, watched the way the heat settled instead of slipping. The air isn't moving, he said, more to himself than to Tobin. That's the difference. He walked the perimeter once, then again. Secondary shell, he added. You've cut the draft before it starts. The wood slows the transfer. The space holds the heat. He did not call it clever. He called it correct. A week later, he put it to paper. Notebooks turned into a single sheet. Plain language, clear steps, something a man could follow without needing to understand why. He pinned it in the mercantile. It did not stay there long. Gideon Voss took it down. Voss ran the largest wood yard in town, sold cut fuel, rented space in his freight barn when storms came in hard. He had seen one shack burn 20 years earlier when green wood and loose ash were stacked wrong in a storm. Since then, he trusted distance more than invention and profit, had learned to stand beside that fear. He found Tobin outside 2 days later. You're telling people to stack fuel inside their homes, he said. No anger in his voice. Just wait. You get one fool doing it wrong, you'll have a fire you can't stop. Tobin did not answer. Voss stepped closer. Men pay for what keeps them alive, he went on. They don't pay for ideas. You start changing that. You start changing more than just how they heat a room. The wind moved between them, low and steady. Truth did not argue in that moment. It stood there, quiet, because on one side was a system that could be measured. On the other was a system that had always worked so long as men stayed dependent on it. Voss held his ground a moment longer. Then he turned and left, not convinced, but not untouched. The change did not announce itself the way men expected. It came quiet. For 2 days, the air softened. Snow along the ridge sank in on itself. The ground gave slightly underfoot. Men in town stepped outside without scarves and spoke of an early turn. Tobin did not change his routine, but Ash did. The dog moved more than usual, not restless in circles, restless in direction. Nose lifted, then lowered, pausing at the door, listening at nothing a man could hear. That was the first sign. The second came with the wind. It did not stop. It shifted. Morning, it came from the west. By noon, it cut low from the north. By evening, it turned again, dragging cold air across the coulee in a way that did not hold a pattern. Tobin noticed it in the way the stove drew. in the way the outer wall cooled unevenly, in the way the air inside the gap held still while everything beyond it did not. The third sign was the sky. Late afternoon, the color changed. Not darker, harder. A flat, metallic gray that did not move with the clouds. It sat over the ridge like something waiting. Thane saw it too. He had come that day without saying why. Stood outside the cabin longer than usual. Watched the line where land met sky. When he finally spoke, it was without emphasis. This one will test everything. He did not explain it. He did not need to. The air dropped that night. Not sharply. Not yet. Just enough to pull the warmth out of the ground and leave the surface brittle. Ash did not sleep. Tobin lay awake longer than he had in months. Not from cold, from the feeling that something had already begun. And out beyond the walls, where the wind moved without resistance, the land went still in a way that did not belong to calm. It belonged to waiting. It came fast. No warning that men in Mercer Fork trusted. No gradual fall they could measure and prepare for. One night, the air held. The next, it dropped. 10 below. 20. 30. By morning, the cold had weight. The wind followed. Hard. Direct. No drift. No swirl. Just force. Driving across Crow's Ridge and down into Blackstone Coulee, then farther into the low streets and barns of Mercer Fork. The first failures were quiet. Wells froze. Not the deep ones. Not yet. The shallow pumps locked first. Handles stiff. Water gone solid in the pipes. Buckets came up empty or rimmed with ice. Then the houses. Heat rose, but it did not stay. Drafts reversed in poorly set stoves. Smoke-filled rooms where chimneys could not draw against the pressure of the wind. Blankets went up over doors and windows. It was not enough. By the second day, livestock began to fall. Cattle stood too long in the open, wind cutting through hide and bone until they stopped moving. Horses turned their backs to the storm and froze where they stood, heads low, breath gone thin. The third day broke what the first two had warned. Inside Tobin's cabin in Blackstone Coulee, the stove burned steady, not hard, not desperate. He fed it from the wall, carefully, one section at a time, pulling from the inner courses, never opening more than a narrow face of the outer shell. The gap held. The structure did not shift. Heat stayed where it was made. Outside, the thermometer dropped past 40 below. Inside, near the stove, it held above 50. The difference stood, not guessed, not hoped, measured. The room held. Day after day, the storm pressed. 11 days in total. No rise above zero. No break in the wind. In town, men moved from house to house. Some left their own and crowded into whatever space held heat longest. Others could not leave in time. Wood burned fast where it was used wrong, slower where it was used well. Too many learned that difference too late. On the fifth day, Thane Hollow came up the ridge. He should not have. The cold had already taken what strength he had left. Each step cost him more than the last. He carried no tools, only a small bundle and the stubborn habit of finishing what he had come to see. He reached the door. Tobin brought him inside. Thane did not speak at first. He looked once at the walls, once at the stove, once at the narrow space that held steady while the world outside broke apart. Then he nodded, not to Tobin, to the work. The room held, he said, his voice thin but certain. He sat. The heat reached him, slow but real. Outside, the wind drove harder. Inside, nothing gave. The system did not fail. The walls did not shift. The air inside the gap did not move. On the seventh day, the temperature bottomed out, 52 below. Inside, the numbers held where they had before, 106 degrees of difference between survival and what waited beyond the walls. By then, the test was no longer in question. The cold had taken what it could from the town. It did not take this room, because the room had been built to hold. And it did. When the wind finally broke, it did not end all at once. It eased. The pressure lifted first, then the air followed. The cold stayed, but without force behind it, it became something a man could face again. What remained was the count. Frozen wells, split beams, rooms that had never held long enough, livestock lost in open ground. 5 people had died, 2 from exposure in outbuildings, 1 from smoke when a stove reversed and filled a room too fast to escape. One old ranch hand froze trying to reach a drifted woodpile. One child did not outlast the fifth night. Families that had learned too late where their walls failed. And one cabin on the ridge that had not. Word moved faster than wagons. By the third day after the storm, men were already coming up the slope, not to argue, to look. Mrs. Lena Brigg came first among them. She stood in the doorway where she had once spoken with certainty, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then, quietly, "Show me." Tobin did not remind her of what she had said before. He walked her to the wall, showed her the gap, the runners, the way the wood stood away from the logs, the way the heat held where it had room to stay. Others followed. Freight hands, smallholders, men who had burned through their supply and still woken cold. They watched, asked less than they expected, understood more than they would have admitted a week before. They went back down and began again. Not all at once, not perfectly, but differently. Gideon Voss did not come to the cabin. He sent wood, one wagon, then another. No note, no explanation. The same man who had pulled the paper from the wall now moved fuel without a word attached to it. He did not say he had been wrong. He did not need to. The storm had said it for him. Mrs. Hester Crow came last. She arrived with a small box, wrapped and carried in both hands, the same kind she had closed in that back room. Inside were papers, older ones, letters that had been written years before and never delivered. Tarlan Voss had sent for someone who might understand. They had not been passed on. She held them out. "I thought I was sparing you a waste," she said. "I was wrong." Tobin took them, looked once, then set them aside. No anger, no demand. The room was warm. The work had been done. What had been lost could not be rebuilt by words. "I understand," he said. And that was enough. Through the next seasons, the method spread, not as theory, as practice. Walls thickened from the inside out. Gaps measured by hand and kept true. Wood stacked first to hold heat, then taken down in order when it was needed. Some called it a trick, others a system. Those who had seen the storm called it what it was, necessary. The laughter from that back room did not disappear. It changed. It became something quieter, something that followed a man when he worked instead of when he spoke. Years later, when new hands came into the valley and asked why some houses held and others did not, the answer was given plain. No long explanation, no lecture. Just a sentence, passed from one man to the next. Stack it before the wind arrives. If you had just one day before winter hit, would you trust a method like this, or stick to what everyone else does? Tell me where you're watching from and what you would choose.